Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast on Chinese philosophy. My name is Richard Kim.
I'm Justin Tewalt.
Hey, Justin. So I've been wondering about this for a while. So, of course, now you teach at Hong Kong University, and you used to teach at San Francisco State University. Both are interesting places. Also, there are some similarities too. Like they're both very hilly. I've been to San Francisco many times. I've lived in Hong Kong. There's beautiful scenery of water and
Yeah,
and
next
so
to the
they're
ocean. Yeah.
yeah, next to the ocean. And but do the similarities stop there, or so what's it
Yeah.
like living in Hong
Uh,
Kong now and teaching there?
right. It's a good question. How much has changed? Both because I used to teach, I guess, nominally American students in San Francisco, although it was a pretty broad spectrum of students, nominally Hong Kongese and Chinese students in Hong Kong. And there too, actually, my students are pretty broad. They're from all over the place. But yeah, so what's changed? Well, I guess one major difference between Hong Kong and San Francisco is that Hong Kong is much hotter, much more hot and humid, many
Hmm.
more hot and humid months of the year. Whereas San Francisco is always about the temperature of a good refrigerator,
Hmm.
almost year round. I miss that. But otherwise, it's quite nice teaching in Hong Kong. Like you say, it's hilly, beautiful, next to the ocean. I like the proximity to China. I like having lots of students who grew up in mainland China and Hong Kong. One thing that both cities have in common, both areas have in common, is that they're actually global. They're cosmopolitan cities.
Hmm.
Hong Kong is, I think, the New York city of East Asia. You know, it
Hmm.
has the largest number of people from all over the world working in business and finance and what have you, major academic institutions that draw people from overseas, much like San Francisco does. And so in some respects, actually, I feel like I'm still living the life of a cosmopolitan academic in both places. But I get to speak Mandarin Chinese much more often. Hong Kong is primarily Cantonese speaking. They speak a different dialect than I do, but I still have many more opportunities to speak modern Mandarin Chinese. And the students are indeed a little bit different. I would say the major difference really is, well, actually, there are two. So in San Francisco, I would have these students who most of them had been raised in the American education system where they're encouraged to challenge the teacher, to speak up in class. In some sense, in the US education system, the heart and soul of a class is its discussion. You know, it's like the actual
Hmm.
interaction between the teacher and the students where they discuss ideas. Whereas in Hong Kong, the students weren't necessarily raised with that expectation. So not all of this, some students, I have to say, are very engaged in discussion, but many of them are not. They're quite accustomed to thinking that the product, the thing that they're supposed to produce to show that they've learned the material, isn't necessarily good questions in class or reactions to texts or comments in class, but actually just the written essays and quizzes and tests and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit harder to get discussion going in my classrooms in Hong Kong, but not that much. Just
Hmm.
this last fall, I had a really lively, dynamic, outgoing class of students in my Chinese ethics, classical Chinese philosophy course that focuses on classical Chinese ethics. So it's just a difference of degree, really, and
Hmm.
not a difference of kind. The
Hmm.
other thing I say, I admit this grudgingly, is that when I was teaching at San Francisco State University, a university I loved and still love, it's like dear to me, these students and my colleagues at San Francisco State, they feel like family. But the kind of reading ethic was not quite as strong there as it is at
Hmm.
HKU at the University of Hong Kong. At HKU, generally speaking, if I assign something and I say it's required, I won't say all the students read it, but
Hmm.
when I show up in class ready to discuss a passage, it's pretty clear that a lot of the students actually have read it.
Hmm.
Whereas precisely because the American students or the students who came up with the American system learns to be really good at producing class discussion ideas and thoughts and questions, they seem to have a little more confidence in their ability to BS, you know? Uh, and so the discussions don't always actually adhere to the text. Sometimes I can tell it's just filler. Um, yeah, so just narrowly on the teaching, I have to say, yeah, that's one difference. I want to just underscore this again. Like it's really just a difference in degree. It's like the students at HKU are slightly more likely to have done the reading,
Hmm.
and they're slightly less likely to sort of voluntarily participate in discussion.
HKU is one of the top universities in East Asia, I believe, right? You must get some very,
Yeah.
very good students there. I mean, they're among some of the best students in all of mainland China, I would think. I mean, Beijing University, of course, is a great university too, but I think
Yeah.
you do get some excellent students at Hong Kong U.
Yes, exactly. The students are really remarkable. In some ways, it's clear where the which universities are the top ones in East Asia, because generally speaking, the kids and their parents just they take an exam, that a kind of qualifying exam,
Hmm.
and then the score determines which university they go to, and they usually go to the best one they can get into. So they're kind of relatively clear, implicit, and oftentimes explicit rankings. And the students who score top on the exam historically have gone to University of Hong Kong. I'm sorry, in the Hong Kong exam, have gone to Hong Kong University.
Mm.
Just recently, Chinese University of Hong Kong, across the bay from us, has started to draw more of the top scorers. That was 1 year before the recent economic troubles in mainland China. Now that ever since the economic troubles have kind of come to a full boil, it seems like the top students are usually choosing HKU again. And then we have a lot of students. The ratio is something like 15 or 20% of our students are from mainland China. And for those students, getting into HKU is even more competitive. Yeah, those students are all really excellent. That said, one nice thing about teaching philosophy, in my experience, Richard, I'm sure you'll have thoughts about this. It does have a kind of universal appeal. So you don't necessarily have to be teaching philosophy to students who are great at math or physics or are really well read and on current issues or what have you, in order to get a good philosophical discussion going.
Hmm.
So there are many advantages in having good students with a lot of discipline and intelligence and curiosity. But I still like to think that I could enjoy my teaching just as much, no
Hmm.
matter where I'm teaching, because I'd like to think, maybe I'm just flattering myself, that I can appeal to the philosopher in anyone, you know?
Yes. No, that's right. I mean, philosophy is a humanistic discipline, and it
Yeah,
touches on some of the core fundamental issues of being a human being. So I think, yeah, as long as you have someone who is curious and they can all kind of recognize the depth of some of these issues,
yeah,
and they don't necessarily have to be, high level, mathematical thinkers. Maybe if you do advanced logic, perhaps I probably
yes,
those
totally.
abstract skills. But yeah, like thinking about like organizing one's life, about ethics, about the good life. I mean, and virtue and character. I think a lot of students will be interested, maybe even all. Yes,
Yeah,
that's exactly right. So, well, it sounds like things are going well in Hong Kong. I
yeah,
remember it being very, very humid and hot, especially during the summer. That was a little bit difficult, although winters were very nice. And
yes, beautiful.
yeah, but I enjoyed my time there. I was there, what, about 3 years with my wife.
Yeah,
And
that's where we first met. I came to
that's right.
for
That's
a
right.
kind of 1 or 2 week visitor position at City U, where you were doing your postdoc. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, good. I guess, yeah, we should say a little bit now about our guest for this episode, Professor Tao Jiang, who has written a terrific book, Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China, which we will be discussing. And sort of to set the stage for that discussion, because one of the core topics is about partiality and impartiality.
Yeah.
Justin, I thought maybe you can sort of discuss that key issue. And I know you have some stuff to say about that. Tell the readers about what that topic is about.
Yes. So it's a big tome of a book. It's a very fascinating, rich book with lots of topics and issues. But if we're going to try to sum it up, this book by Tao Jiang, it seems like the major aim or concern is to look again at the classical Chinese texts, particularly their discussion of ethics and politics, and reread those texts as engaged in a great sort of discourse, almost a kind of dialectic, having to do with the pull of two different kinds of norms in our moral and political lives, two different sorts of ideals. One ideal we'll call the partialistic one, the other one we'll call the impartialistic one. And these days, since most of us live in large countries where impartialism, say impartiality among citizens, is highly valued, we can immediately understand why impartiality is a good thing in ethics and politics. So let's say, for example, that you are living in a state or a city state or what have you, and there's someone, a prime minister or a president or someone in charge, an executive of the state, and he's just appointing his own family members to all the good positions, the ones that are well compensated, the ones that come with power and prestige. And these people aren't particularly well qualified. They're not doing their jobs well, but he's doing it because he loves his family members and he likes to support his kids and siblings and so on. That's a partialistic motive, love of family, preference for one's own family, that in many modern political societies is highly suspect. We think that justice, that when it comes to politics, to a lot of the sort of aims that we have in politics and in legal regimes and what have you, we should be impartial. Basically, positions should be decided on the basis of merit, certain qualifications that don't necessarily track or have anything to do with the relationships, like family relationships or friendships between people. So an impartialistic commitment in politics would be the commitment to appointing the best people for the job when you're a prime minister, appointing the best minister of justice, the best minister of education, the people who have the right qualifications, the people who are good at managing offices and making sure that the job gets done, that kind of thing. That's a kind of impartialistic commitment. But partialism is something that all of us, I think, maybe, well, most of us anyway, believe has some value and an important place in the moral life as well. We think, for example, that we really should go out of our way and go to extraordinary measures to do good things, to take care of and protect the interests of our children, our parents, our siblings, our close friends. We think that we have special duties and obligations to advocate for them, to protect them, that don't apply to total strangers. So when you talk about partialism and impartialism in the context of classical Chinese philosophy, it seems like it's worth, I think our listeners should know that this is already a sensitive topic. It's already, as soon as you mention impartialism, people will know that this is a controversial issue that's very much at the heart of a lot of debate in classical Chinese philosophy, because there's a school of thought called Mohism, spelled M-O-H-I-S-M. That's the standard spelling, which seems committed to something that they call impartial care. On the other hand, the Confucians are often traditionally understood as being deeply committed to partialism, to especially familial partialism or consanguineous partialism. They say the partialism of privileging or being particularly concerned with the interests of your family members. So that's essentially the debate. There's a passage in the Analects of Confucius, 1318, where a duke brags to Confucius that there's this member of his community named Upright Gong. And Upright Gong is called upright because his father stole a sheep and he reported him to the authorities. So the Duke seems very proud of this. He's like, look how loyal my subjects are. Look what good citizens they are. This guy, Upright Gong, he even turned in his own father for stealing his sheep because that was, how dare he break the law? We need people who are law-abiding like him. So Confucius replies, surprisingly, oh, that's strange. Among my people, those who we consider upright are different from this. Fathers cover up for their sons and sons cover up for their fathers. Uprightness can be found in this. So essentially, Confucius, for the rest of Chinese history, throws down the gauntlet for partialism. He thinks that at least when it comes to family loyalty, family devotion, it's better to be partialistic, even if that means that you sometimes violate your impartialistic duties to obey the law and what have you. Those are just two schools of thought, Confucianism and Mohism, two texts, the Analects and the Mozi, which is the foundational text for Mohism, that weigh in on this great debate about partialism and impartialism. There are many other texts in the classical tradition, and one of the interesting, innovative things about Tao Jiang's book is that he reads them all as struggling in some ways with the appeal of both impartialistic justice, as he calls it, and partialistic humaneness or benevolence. And so that is what we will discuss in much greater detail after the break. All right, we are delighted to have as our guest Tao Jiang, and in Chinese it's Jiang Tao, family name Jiang. He's a professor with appointments both in religion and philosophy at Rutgers University. For several years, he was the chair of the Department of Religion at Rutgers. So Tao is actually a specialist. It's funny, for years I thought of him as someone who, like me, had wide-ranging interests and was willing to teach all kinds of Chinese thought. But I always thought of him as a specialist in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, especially Yogacara, or consciousness-only Buddhism. And he wrote a really great book on Yogacara Buddhism and modern psychology. But more recently, the book that he wrote, and the one that we're discussing today, is on classical Chinese philosophy, particularly classical moral and political philosophy. That's the one, just to give you the title, is called Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China. So he's just a wide-ranging and expert in Chinese philosophy, I think is perhaps the best way to describe him. So in addition to being a very well-respected scholar, well-respected for his scholarship, he's also very well-liked among those of us who know him. He's just a very charming and witty person. I remember he said sort of humbly that when he first published this book, which is a giant book, that it would make a good door jam, if nothing else. And I just find him a sort of reliable and faithful colleague and friend. So let's just say, hypothetically, that you find yourself stuck in a hotel in Athens, Greece, after midnight, and you realize that you need cash in order to pay for a cab to the airport the next day. And so you have no choice but to venture out into this tough neighborhood and look for a cash machine. Tao is, I can say, with a lot of confidence, the kind of person who would accompany you out into the tough neighborhood to help you retrieve money for the taxi. So anyway, that's just a tiny little glimpse of the fuller person in all his dimensions. Welcome, Tao.
Thank you, Justin, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Richard. And thank both of you for introducing me and for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited.
So the book is called Origins of Moral Political Philosophy in Early China. Yes, we'd like to start with our guests by sort of offering a kind of overall summary or synopsis of the book as we understand it, and then just check with our guests to make sure that we've understood it correctly.
Yes. Once again, it's so great to have you here, Tao. I read this book over the summer, and I was rereading it again and just found it incredibly rich. There's just so much in this book. So obviously, we won't be able to cover everything, but yeah, let me begin with a basic outline. I'm just going to identify 3 key points defended in the course of the book. These 3 points are actually offered by Tao himself at one point in the book, so I hope I don't get this wrong. But for some of the listeners who haven't read the book, I think it might be helpful and contextualize it. So the first point is that an important framework for understanding the classical Chinese traditions and thinkers is to see how they worked out the relationships among the domains of the individual, familial, and the political. For example, how did they resolve problematic cases in which there's a tension between 2 of the domains, let's say? A second central point of the book is that we can illuminate our understanding of the debates among the different traditions and schools of thought in early China by grasping how they aim to resolve conflict between 2 competing values, partialist humaneness and impartialist justice. Those are the words chosen by him, and we may get into a little bit about exactly what that means. The third central point of the book is that Zhuangzi and the Zhuangists occupied a unique position in the history of classical Chinese philosophy by detaching themselves from the debate between impartialist humaneness and impartialist justice thinkers, for example, the Confucians and the Mohists. And the Zhuangists themselves saw that whole debate as kind of a barren enterprise, perhaps also politically problematic and so forth. And so instead, the Zhuangists advocated personal freedom as really the key value we should aspire to obtain. So I think those are 3 of the central points of the book. Tao, do you have anything perhaps to revise or correct or maybe expand from those 3 points?
Thank you. That was very good capture of the central thesis of the book. I guess one teeny bit I would add is the overall context. The context that all of these efforts took place within this understanding of heaven that was evolving, as well as the heaven and human relationship that was also evolving. So that was the overarching context, which will be central to the story, depends on how heaven was understood and how the relationship between heaven and human were understood. It also have profound implications in the kind of philosophical project, the kind of moral political project that was sort of constructed. I think one thing, if I can add a little bit, is, the goal of the book, I think it's Sellers said something like the aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hand together in the broadest sense of the term. So I think in some ways my book is, of course, in a much narrower sense, attempt to see how discussions in classical Chinese philosophy kind of hand together, right? How these normative deliberation, how they sort of hand together. That will be the tidbit I want to add. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. That's an apt way of describing the goal of the book, I think. It is not just a kind of case-by-case study of individual philosophers and texts. It seems to be an attempt to put these philosophers in dialogue with each other, particularly on the issue of impartialist justice and more partialist humaneness. Yeah, so maybe I could, if you're willing to bear with me a little bit, just to explain to all of our listeners, including the people who may not have a lot of background in Chinese philosophy, I just want to say a little bit more about partialism and impartialism. So this will kind of be a way, I guess, of introducing my question. So basically, there's this idea that impartialism is, well, as Tao himself defines it, the view that, I guess I'm using my own words here, but the content of your sort of moral, ethical, political values are neutral with respect to the relationship between the agent and the recipient. So, like sometimes we think that there's a basic duty to help people in need, to assist someone who's in dire trouble, regardless of your relationship to them, whether that person is your sister, your brother, a total stranger, a member of another country or what have you. If a person is drowning and it's easy for you to rescue them, you should. That's a kind of impartialist duty. Whereas partialism is, in this sense, kind of moral, ethical, political partialism is a case where the value, the responsibility, the duty depends upon the relationship between the agent and the recipient. So tend to think that we have special responsibilities to our children, our parents, family members, close friends, spouses, and so on. And so it's a really nice lens through which to read the Chinese tradition. We have a number of different philosophers, some of them very decidedly on the impartialist side, others very decidedly on the partialist side. Our listeners have not yet been introduced by us to all of the philosophers that you discussed, Tao. So we've mostly focused on Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, and Confucius and Mencius, Kongzi and Mengzi, the sort of early classical Confucian philosophers. So we haven't yet introduced Moism, and we haven't introduced legalism yet. But one thing we can say, I don't want to sort of overwhelm everyone with all these schools of thought, but I will say very briefly that there is a school of thought known as Moism, who are sort of unabashed, about their interest in impartialism, at least on the reading that I find most plausible. Big proponents of this doctrine, Jian Ai, impartial care, concern. So they fit rather nicely into your narrative about the history of Chinese thought as major proponents of impartialism. And then Mencius, Mengzi, is a pretty strong partialist on your account. You note that there's still some tensions in his thought, but for the most part, he's arguing explicitly against Moist impartialism. So we have those sort of two schools of thought standing at opposite ends of the spectrum, really. But to give listeners a sense of the way the other major figures fit into this narrative, let me just mention they'll be most familiar with, Confucius and Zhuangzi. So Zhuangzi, I think, as Richard already mentioned in his summary, ends up being an interesting outlier. So he doesn't really stand strongly on one side or the other. Instead, he stands for a kind of personal freedom. Confucius is also an interesting case because as you read Confucius, over and against the sort of orthodox reading of Confucius as in lockstep with Mencius, you say Confucius, in this case, isn't in lockstep with Mencius. He has a vision of ideal virtue, Ren, which is normally translated as humaneness, as a kind of virtue that straddles both impartialist justice and partialist humaneness. And you think, in fact, there are some tensions in his view that sort of are reflected in text. If I could just speculate a little bit about what is probably being received as the most controversial and therefore interesting thesis in your reading of Confucius, in particular, the Analects of Confucius. It seems like it's really just this claim that ren, understood as usually as a humaneness or goodness, is a virtue that's meant to somehow both synthesize or straddle both partialism and impartialism, and that it is taking justice into account in some way. So that's controversial because, as the two of you know well, usually when scholars write about this issue in the context of classical Confucianism, they're quick to say, these Confucians, they are decidedly partialists. And there's a sort of standard passage that everyone likes to cite, known as the upright gong passage. That's Analects 13:18. And so just to give the discussion, our discussion, a little bit of kind of a concrete focus, I thought I would sort of inform our readers of that passage, and then maybe we could begin our discussion from there. So the upright gong passage goes like this. Kongzi, Confucius, is speaking to a ruler, as he often does, and the ruler seems to be bragging that his subjects, the people in his state, I think the state is She, S-H-E, he has some particularly virtuous or upright, morally upright people among them. He says, for example, there was a father who stole his sheep, and his son turned him in for that. That's how loyal his son was. And Kongzi snaps back that that's entirely the wrong way of thinking about uprightness. He says, where I come from, fathers cover up for their sons, sons cover up for their fathers, and uprightness consists in that. So that's the upright gong passage, and it is often mentioned as evidence of Confucius's partialism. But you, Tao, think that's not the end of the story. That in fact, despite the upright gong passage, which seems to be taking sides in the partialism debate, there's still plenty of evidence that Confucius in the Analects struggles with partialism, and he feels the pull of a kind of impartialist demand for justice. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, indeed, the Zhigong passage is a very clear, probably the strongest expression of the partialist sentiment. I fully agree. But what makes the Analects fascinating and interesting as a text is we can say it's not coherent or it's not consistent, right? Sometimes it takes on different positions. Another way to think about it is that maybe at that point, these positions hasn't been completely settled, right? So positions were still much in fluid, as in the way the text was constructed. So which allows us to read different passages differently and actually to contest this sort of a partialist reading of the Confucius, of the Analects especially. So I'll give the example in the Analects is Confucius' evaluation of these prominent ancient figures, very instructive. So the Bo Yi and Shu Qi, right? These are really famous personality, ruler of some small kingdom. Neither of them wanted to inherit the kingdom, so they sort of fled, both quit the throne. But then when the King Wu of Zhou launched this military campaign to overthrow the Shang king, Bo Yi and Shu Qi, they sort of chastised the King Wu and saying, you were not being loyal. How can you do this to your ruler, right? To the Shang king. So then they refused to eat anything. After the conquest, after Zhou was established, the Bo Yi and Shu Qi, they refused to eat anything because they, now the food belongs to the Zhou, and both of them starved to death after some days. And so that's a sort of an expression of their very strong loyalty towards the Shang king against the King Wu of Zhou. So that's one kind of partiality in the political context. But then there's the other case, what I see to be rather interesting story about Guanzhong, right, who was a chief minister of Qi Huangong, who was a very, very pivotal figure. Confucius' assessment of Guanzhong was really interesting and controversial. When his disciple asked him, how do you think about Guanzhong? On the one hand, he said, well, he was not a person of, he didn't understand ritual, right? Which is kind of a very damning comment on a person of a high status. This is in Analects 14:16. A conversation between Confucius and Zilu, and where Zilu asked, when the Duke Huan had his brother murdered, so Shaohu, this is somebody else who worked for the prince that was murdered, he died for his master, as it was expected to do under those circumstances, whereas Guanzong didn't. So does this behavior not fall short of Ren, right? That, Guanzong should have followed his master to death, or at least venge for his master. So Confucius replied that, well, it was Guanzhong's strength that allows the Duke Huan, the Qi Huan Gong, on many occasions to harmoniously unite the feudal lords without the use of military forces. And so then he trailed into this expression of Ru Qi Ren, Ru Qi Ren. How to translate this Ru Qi Ren?
Yeah. I'll explain to our readers. Yeah, Ru Qi Ren is, in classical Chinese, I guess the most literal way to translate it is something like at like or equal to. Yeah, such as his humaneness.
Right, such is his Ren, right? He seems to be saying that he can be understood as a person of Ren, which is the highest moral virtue in the Analects. That's one. And then you get other passages in the Analects which Confucius was even more praising the Guanzhong and saying, well, indeed, he was actually a person of Ren. So which means that, yes, on the one hand, if we interpret Ren in terms of the partialist humaneness, the fact that he didn't avenge the death of his own master, and he instead went to work for the person who killed his master, was problematic on the humanist ground, on this partialist humanist ground. But then on the other hand, what he was able to accomplish, what he was able to do, right, in this new status, he was able to bring peace and prosperity all over the world, and that should account for something. I thought that was a very interesting comment on how he understands these different understanding of the valence of Ren.
Yeah, so if I could just fill in a little bit to explain to the listeners who don't know so much about the historical context. So Guanzhong is this famous prime minister. He was the prime minister to Duke Huan of Qi. That's who Tao was referring to earlier. And he's famous because Duke Huan of Qi was, on a certain account of history, the first of 5 hegemons, which is to say the first of 5 people to unite these competing, sometimes warring states in the spring and autumn period, a tough time, a kind of time of civil war and disorder in ancient China. And he's credited with uniting the rival states peacefully. So he was a hegemon who brought a great deal of good to the central states, to China at the time. And usually credit goes to Guanzhong, this prime minister, because of his sort of able advising and his wisdom about matters of political and social order. So Guanzhong seems to have had a very good effect that was very much in the interest of people as a whole. So I think it's impartialist in that sense. Is that right?
Yes.
Like, who can argue with the value of bringing peace to the empire? But on the other hand, in order to get there, he was not quite as loyal to his original patron as this other figure that you were comparing him with earlier. This other figure basically willingly went to his own death when the Duke Huan of Qi, who became this first hegemon, murdered his brother, Prince Zhou, in order to become the duke. And then Guanzhong is compared to someone else who, when his patron, Prince Zhou, was murdered, willingly died as well. Guanzhong was not so self-sacrificial. He quickly transferred his loyalty to the new duke. And so you can see why and so that kind of loyalty to your patron is seen as a more partialistic value in line with humaneness. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah, so you can see why someone like Confucius would be torn in his analysis of his kind of historical assessment of Guanzhong's character.
Right, indeed, yeah. Very good, yeah. Thanks for filling all the blank. Another way to argue for the dimension of justice in Ren, right, this core virtue, meta virtue in the Analects, is to see the relationship between the Golden Rule and Ren in the Analects. That the Golden Rule has this constitutive role of Ren in the Analects. At least that's the way I read the text. And the Golden Rule, in the book, I go into detail about sort of analyzing different aspects of the Golden Rule. And one of the important dimension is the dimension of reversibility, which kind of leveling the field, right? If you can put yourself, do not do to others what you do not want for yourself. It has this leavening effect of seeing other people in light of yourself and see yourself in other people. That also sort of brings to this just impartialist justice dimension to it.
Yeah. If I could just elaborate on that a little bit. So that's an interesting case. The Golden Rule, to fill people in, there are actually a number of formulations in the classical Confucian canon, including in the Analects, that could arguably be articulations of or references to the Golden Rule. But the most famous one is is surely Analects 15:24, where someone asks Kongzi, if there's one word that can sum up the way, what is it? Confucius says surely it would be shu, which is sometimes translated as reciprocity, sometimes translated as sympathetic understanding. But then he goes on to sort of give an account or description of what shu means. He says, that which you do not desire for yourself, do not inflict on others. So it's a kind of negative version of the golden rule. Sometimes people call it the silver rule. I think of it as a golden rule myself. Yeah, and so what's interesting about that, besides the fact that he sort of endorses the golden rule, is that it's supposed to be the one word or the one doctrine which sums up his way. That makes it sound like it's very important. And so Tao's point is, well, given that Confucius spends a lot of time articulating a partialistic ethic of humaneness in his many descriptions of how children should behave towards their parents and younger siblings should behave towards their older siblings and subjects should behave towards their ruler or their lord and so on, it seems like it's sort of interesting that suddenly he's now, when asked to provide a kind of one-word summary or short doctrine to describe his way, he's invoking what looks like an impartialistic principle, which is treating others as you would want to be treated yourself. That's another tough case. Actually, though, if I could elaborate on that a little bit, I have a hard time separating my reading of the tradition from the kind of later Confucian philosophers that I look at. So the traditional commentators, including Zhu Xi, the Song Dynasty commentator who was enormously influential. Actually, it's surprising to me when I look back at it how often they use the language of justice to refer to formulations of the Golden Rule. So they often say that the purpose of the Golden Rule is it could be translated as to make sure that each person achieves their proper place or gets their proper allotment. So they often use that language, and ge de qi suo, ge de qi fen, right? And sometimes they even make reference, Zhu Xi and others make reference to ping, a kind of fairness or equality as being one of the aims of the Golden Rule. So there's a sense in which it seems like it's very much concerned with justice. I think that's, at least as the tradition went on to develop, it seems like that's right. But another question, I think, it's another claim entirely to say that it's an impartialistic justice. So there's a couple of reasons one might have doubts about that. The first one is simply that there's this sort of background picture of Confucianism, according to which Confucians are proponents of what they sometimes call graded care or graded concern. And so the image that's often invoked in these contexts is that of a series of concentric circles. So at the center of these concentric circles are your immediate family members, your siblings, parents and children, grandparents maybe, and grandchildren. And then the next circle out would be, more distant family members and close friends. The next circle out might include like neighbors or members of your immediate community, maybe coworkers, and so on and so forth. And eventually you reach a circle closer to the perimeter, or to the periphery, that maybe just includes all of human beings that aren't connected with you in some special way. And then maybe even further out, there are concentric circles for non-human animals or plant or life in general. And so the idea, of course, is that you have the strongest obligations and you have sort of special obligations, particularly demanding or particularized obligations towards those people that are at the center of this series of concentric circles. And then weaker and more generalizable, more fungible obligations to people, or not even people, but people and things in the periphery, And so one way of accounting for Confucian views about impartialist justice is just to say, well, the norms of impartialist justice are built into that concentric circle that's closer to the periphery. So what you owe human beings in general that have no special relationship to you, those are the obligations that sort of govern how you treat, how you think about, strangers and maybe fellow citizens or what have you. I suppose on one reading you could say that's an attempt to build in a certain kind of impartialism. But I'm tempted to say that the better way to think about it is as a fundamentally partialistic or relational understanding of justice, according to which, what you owe to people is determined by your relationship to them. And you have very strong obligations to people who are close to you and much weaker ones to those that have no special relationship to you. it's still fundamentally governed in some sense by the relationship, even if it turns out that there's a large number of people that you should treat more or less the same, regardless of. That's sort of one concern I have, is I wonder if there isn't just some way of kind of saying that while there is some allowance for impartialism in the Confucian picture, it's still more fundamentally built on a foundation which is more relational and partialistic.
I mean, I'm amenable to that interpretation, and because the partialist understanding of the Confucian project is very much prevalent and dominant, and I do not want to challenge that. I just wanted to sort of complicate the picture a little bit and to see that particularly what's interesting for the purpose of the book is that the way that Shu was highlighted, in the way that contemporary scholars, actually a lot of contemporary scholars didn't know how to deal with Shu, because a lot of them thought that this actually doesn't really fit in the kind of virtue-based Confucian project, in the analects at least. And what's also intriguing is that the Shu actually just disappears in the Mencius, which is really interesting. And I sort of try to tie that to the stronger orientation towards partialism in Mencius, and the absence of Shu in some ways sort of, strengthened that argument. And the Shu in some ways was actually picked up by the Moist, and who actually pushed the logic of the Golden Rule to its logical conclusion, and which ends up being the teaching of the impartial care, right, Jiang. To see the trajectory of these different aspects of Confucius' teaching in the later thinkers was also very useful in terms of just understanding the nature, the tension that's involved, the nature of his teaching, what it is that he was trying to grapple with.
Yeah, I also just had a quick question. So about the golden rule as formulated there, do not do unto others what you do not want for yourself. That also does seem a little bit different from justice. So I just finally watched John Wick with my wife a couple weeks ago. And a lot of people might think, hey, he got justice done, like justice was served, right? Yeah, or these revenge movies. And certainly what's going on there seems quite different from the golden rule as formulated by Confucius. So I was wondering, if that is justice, because I was also wondering if you might think of what's animating the golden rule as also having to do with concern or care and concern for others' well-being. Partly because I was thinking, justice doesn't necessarily mean doing good to others. Or, that's one way maybe some people might think of it more and more now, because people seem to be against retributive punishment and things like that. But at least classically, the concept of justice seemed like it could actually involve punishment or some kind of reparation or things like that. So, I was just curious about what you thought of that.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think Confucius was actually against punishment necessarily, even though, of course, he was supposedly against law or punitive punishment according to the strong penal laws. But, he had this famous saying that only a personal Ren know how to like a person and how to hate a person, or which brings in the element of desert, right? Some people just deserve to be treated in certain ways, and people should be treated as their desert warrants. I think that's a element of justice, again, in the way that analects is constructed. So it's also, kind of interesting in that regard. And I agree with you. It's not all just love. No, not quite.
But actually, that's fair enough. But I think another thing Richard is pointing to is that there's a way in which we can understand justice as, in fact, agent relative and recipient relative. I haven't seen John Wick, but I take it that
she dies and she leaves him this present final gift of a dog, and the mafia's son kills his dog. And then, of course, John Wick turns out to be, a bad dude who went into peace. But now, of course, he's going to get his revenge. That's basically the plot.
Yeah, sometimes the ethics of revenge is very agent relative. There's a traditional sort of view according to which it's the prerogative of the surviving family members or the victims, if they survive, to get revenge. It's not something that the state should do or that a total stranger should do. But, so it's John Wick who gets to go out and get revenge. And it's in virtue of the fact that he's John Wick and it was his dog that he's entitled to it. That's a very agent relative way of thinking about it.
But that's interesting. I think in the way that the analects discuss it, that would qualify as a case of humaneness, right? Because of the partiality. And think about the way that Guanzong, didn't avenge his patron's, sort of murder and how problematic that might be. And I sort of catch that in terms of the partialist humaneness. And the justice, I don't sort of define justice in that sense. Of course, the word justice has so many meanings. And so I meant it specifically in the book as this agent-recipient neutral, agent-recipient independent. I forgot somebody said something that it's hard to define anything that has a history, which of course justice is one of those terms that depends on how it's been defined, then it gets to be discussed in very, very different kind of fashion. So is humaneness. Yeah.
Fair enough, right. So you're just sort of stipulating that you don't mean justice in every sense, but impartial is justice. But I'm still tempted by this view that the better way to account, I'm not sure about this, but I'll just say it. It's at least out there as an option for reading the Confucian tradition, including the Analects of Confucius, that the better way to understand justice is as a value that's somehow grounded in this more partialistic humaneness, which makes allowances for certain kinds of relationships where, because you're not any kind of personal connection to someone, you should just sort of treat them like you do all other human beings. And as I say, that kind of far out circle in the series of concentric circles. And so one of the reasons I'm tempted by that actually has to do with this very idea of golden rule thinking. So another classical text, supposedly, may in fact be a Han Dynasty text, is the Great Learning, the Da Xue, which has a number of formulations of the golden rule. And as scholars sometimes like to point out, what's really interesting about those formulations of the golden rule and Great Learning is that they're sort of role specific. So there's this version that says what you hate in the treatment that those above give you, do not inflict on those below you, right? What you hate in those below you do not inflict on, and so on and so forth. And so, one way of reading that you see in the later Confucian philosophers that I work on is what you hate in your superiors, don't inflict on your subordinates, What you hate in your subordinates, don't inflict on your superiors, and so on. And so those strike me as attempts to formulate the golden rule in ways that are actually conditioned by the agent and recipient's relationships. So I guess I'm just saying it's a possibility. It seems like it's a plausible argument that you could make that golden rules, as they were understood in the classical context, weren't necessarily meant to be totally impartial.
I agree. I think that's the dominant interpretation, that golden rule is also kind of confined to roles. It's more role specific. But what I wanted to do is to break out a little bit of that and say that it's, that doesn't exhaust the possibility of the shu in the text. And because of the sort of lack of context in many of these passages, then there's kind of fluidity, right? Whereas in some other texts, that's more constrained in terms of the interpretive possibilities. The impartialist aspect, I see it as a possible interpretation of this particular dimension of shu, which then picked up by later thinkers, but then rejected by others. The Confucius attitudes in the Analects, sort of provide certain kind of script for that kind of development.
Okay, good. Well, I think we should just broaden it out a little bit and talk about your treatment of some of the other texts. I think the one that we want to be sure that we get to, simply because this is the philosopher or the text that sort of is the protagonist of your story, is the Zhuangzi, right?
Right.
Zhuangzi, in the great debates about impartialist justice and partialist humaneness, Zhuangzi is an outlier, but a good one. And you almost sort of suggest wistfully one that the Chinese political tradition would have done well to pay more attention to. So Zhuangzi is a proponent of personal freedom. Yeah, this is, I find your discussion of Zhuangzi very interesting and really rich and fun to think about. So as a proponent of personal freedom, you admit that he has a kind of vision of freedom that doesn't necessarily prize what we now think of as sort of institutional or social or political freedom. He's not necessarily talking about creating institutions that protect you, that give you some sphere of life in which you are free to go about and make your own decisions uncoerced, It's more like he's interested in people finding their own way to a kind of spiritual or psychological freedom from the constraints of very relational, understandings of the self, moral duties and obligations and rituals. So first of all, I just want to invite you, Tao, to sort of correct me if I haven't described your view with enough nuance. But then I wanted to add one other thing, which I think is quite interesting about the book, which is that as you see it, this represents both a really great moment of insight in the Chinese tradition, but also a missed opportunity, because sometimes you use this language, the path not taken. You say, because there was no attempt, there was no sort of vision for creating institutions that protect a sphere of freedom socially and politically, China didn't have the chance to sort of develop just a kind of a free political regime, you know. So did I get that right?
Right. Absolutely, yes. Which is very tragic in Chinese history. There's this very rich deliberation of personal freedom that was just left to be marginalized and led to be sort of internalized, and which is what I see the Zhuangist notion of personal freedom. That's the sort of trajectory that it becomes this internal dynamic, the domain of the heart mind, the Xin, or for those hermits who lives at the margin of the social political world. And that's where the sort of the personal freedom sort of thrived in Chinese history, but not so much in terms of integrated into the way that institutions are built or even imagined.
Yeah. What's interesting about your view, though, is that you think the way that might have emerged as a way of sort of institutionalizing personal freedom would have been essentially a marriage of Zhuangism, which is to say Zhuangist Taoism, the Taoism of Zhuangzi, and Fajia, better known to our listeners probably as legalism. So legalism, for those who don't know, is this ancient school of political thought, which is sometimes characterized as a kind of state interest first or ruler's interest first political philosophy, as a sort of cynical or pessimistic view of human nature and the possibility of improving people, which more or less says the ruler should do whatever ruler can prudently do or would wisely do to get all of the various parts of the machinery of state working together to serve certain state interests. So that's one way of understanding it, but there's another way of understanding the sort of deep insights of legalism as being a kind of early formulation of institutionalism, of almost a kind of early theorizing about bureaucracy, where state government, state bureaucracies are understood as institutions that can stand apart in some sense from the people who run them and occupy them. There's a way in which the machinery of state can stand up independently of the sort of will or the capability or capacity of the people who run those states. As I understand it, Tao, you basically think if legalism had sort of prized personal freedom more highly, we'd be at least a giant step closer to something like governments where we have rule of law and not rule of persons. And the rule of law is primarily, or has as a major value, the protection of a sphere of liberty. Is that right?
Yes, that will be a sort of an imagined alternative path of the way that Chinese, politics developed historically. Indeed, I take the legalists or the Fajia thinkers. I didn't use legalism in the book because there's some problem with the translation of Fa as, law. Because in classical Chinese, of course, Fa has a broader sort of meanings and implications. So the law could be Fa, but Fa might not be law. So in any case, so I decided to stick with the transliteration of Fajia. You laid out very well that the understanding of Fajia as a status, blah, 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 that restriction, or as alternatively as a sort of a theorist of bureaucracy. I very much take the latter approach that Fajia thinker, they were really extraordinary. They were just in many ways ahead of its time, especially when we compare to Western thinkers, that they were so advanced in terms of institutionalize the power and to bureaucratize the state. And they treated the political power much, much more seriously, right? They see it, that political power as something that operates on its own, that it has its own domain of its own dynamics, its own rules. It needs to be regulated differently from sort of the moral domain, from the way that virtues are understood and so forth. So I think that has a lot of insight in terms of the way that the state institution should be set up, should function. And what I think the part of the tragedy of the lack of incorporation of the Zhuang's vision of personal freedom in Chinese history is precisely the sense that freedom is not understood as an institution, right? It's understood just as an individual, as a personal effort. That is very, very unfortunate. But of course, how to incorporate personal freedom into this Fajia framework is not just an intellectual sort of exercise of trying to incorporate them and then that will work, because of course no state wants to give up its power. And how to regulate the state, control itself, how to regulate power, how to limit power, which is really what freedom is about, how to regulate and limit power, constrain power within the institution of the state itself, requires something that's much, much more sort of than simply just an idea of personal freedom.
So in the West, I mean, part of the reason why classical liberalism developed was because of these deep conflicts, especially religious conflicts. And I think people realizing that, we can't impose our conceptions of the good, or a lot of us want to, but then it just will not end well. I was wondering if one reason why this kind of envisioned path of the marriage of Zhuangism and legalism didn't quite unfold was because there wasn't that kind of hard, I mean, there were plenty of wars and terrible violence, obviously, but there wasn't that kind of deep disagreement anchored in religion or morality that actually unfolded later in the West. I was wondering if you think that might be one reason why it didn't quite go in that direction. I mean, I'm sure there's many possible reasons, but because at least on my understanding of the political developments of the West, that was at least a really important impetus, because people realized, no, we need a more kind of a neutrality with regard to conceptions of the good because of these deep religious and moral disagreements. How do you think of that, Tao?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's absolutely correct. The fact that religion in Chinese history did not exist as a separate institution, right, independent from the state, it has this monumental effect on Chinese political history. Because as we know that in European history, of course, for example, the Catholic Church was at one point was very, very powerful. And it was so powerful that it could even overthrow political leaders. In Chinese history, that never happened. The separation of this church and the state, and I don't mean as a political ideal, I just meant as a historical fact, was really, really important in the European history, such that people can imagine, a different kind of order that is not dominated by politics, right? The church as a separate institution that has a direct access to the will of God, sanctioned by this divine will that has even a higher authority than the political rulers. That has a really, really important impact on the way that political freedom unfolded and was even imagined in the history of Europe. That's absolutely the case. So I think the church or religion as an institution, separate or independent, by and large independent of the state, is absolutely crucial in the West, in the way that it didn't really happen in China.
I was wondering if another aspect to this is that in early China, actually, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this from both of you. There wasn't this idea that, like, relativism, I don't know, I'm not sure if anyone's worked on it, but my understanding of the text, although I think our previous guest, Jinghu, would disagree with me, wasn't really like a prominent kind of line of thought. I mean, of course, there were disagreements, that's for sure, about what's good and what's bad. But there wasn't this kind of, I mean, I guess we do find that in the Zhuangzi, interestingly, which is what makes it a remarkable text. But generally in early China, I would imagine among the everyday people and among most traditions, there wasn't this thought that like there wasn't some real goods out there, or that what is good is determined by one's own beliefs or desires. I don't think that was really a prominent thing. So that would also make it a little bit tougher, or because that more of that idea of the neutrality of the conception of the good seems like a really important part of that movement toward what today we call more of a classically liberal view, stemming from pluralism. So I was wondering if that might be another part of the story of why this kind of view didn't unfold, at least in early China.
I would probably take a more institutional view in the sense that I think a lot of the ideas, they need to have an institutional anchor. Let's say humaneness has family, or clan as the institutional anchor, whereas the sort of impartialist justice has the state as the anchor. And now the boundary between the two is really where the contestation took place. Whereas the personal freedom didn't really have an institutional anchor. So it was just completely left to the person themselves to, fend for themselves, to carve out a place against all of these other kinds of very, very powerful forces of the institution, of the clan, of the family, and of the state. So I tend to see it in that way.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm tempted by a view that's somewhat like, at least in its broad contours, the one that Richard described, that maybe because of the lack of deep religious conflict, you don't see people flirting with a sort of deep or thoroughgoing relativism in ancient Chinese texts quite like you do in some Western philosophy. It's very difficult because I find that, generally speaking, when someone articulates a relativistic view, if you press them, they'll be sort of ambivalent or ambiguous as to how committed they really are to their relativism. But I do want to say that I agree with Tao's point that it's, one of the main issues seems to be that they just didn't take anything like liberal neutrality as an institutional value. So I work on these later Confucian philosophers, and I'm quite interested in later Confucian political thought. There's this view among those who work on Neo-Confucian political thought or later Confucian political thought that they just never quite saw the implications of the political problems that arose for institution building and institutional reform. So there's a pretty influential book by Ted DeBary, that last name is spelled Debary, and called The Trouble with Confucianism. And actually, it turns out it's about many different kinds of troubles that Confucians face. But one of them is just that he thinks the Confucians never quite understood that Confucians relied heavily on this idea of the virtuous minister who, despite all of these incentives to capitulate to the powerful and just tell the ruler what the ruler wants to hear and feed the ruler praise and compliments and all the policies that they preferred and that kind of thing, Confucian political view relied very heavily on this idea that there would be these extremely virtuous advisors, Confucian advisors, who, out of their sort of commitment to the people, essentially, of the state, the sort of welfare of the ordinary people, would sometimes be motivated to great acts of moral courage and heroism, and speaking truth to power, telling rulers things they don't want to hear when the policy is going very badly, and so on. But DeBary's view is essentially that the Confucians never quite saw the importance of creating institutions so that Confucian advisors have incentives and protections when they speak truth to power. Instead, it just relied so much on strength of character.
You need tenure.
Yeah, exactly. They needed tenure. Yeah. Of course, there are lots of exceptions. I mean, it's a vast, complicated tradition. So there were more institutionally oriented thinkers. There were institution builders, the most famous being Huang Zongxi, this late Ming, early Qing guy who wanted to protect a certain amount of sort of academic freedom in the academies and force the emperor to sit and listen to local scholars debating local circumstances and conditions, speaking freely about them. But anyway, the point is, on the whole, I think that view is right. So there is something to be said for this general claim that compared to some political thought in the West anyway, there wasn't quite a focus on the implications of some of these values for institution building.
Right. I mean, there might be cases of good, political practice, right, in these different episodes when an enlightened ruler was at the helm. Then, of course, in the Han and in other dynasties, then, they have this broad consultation. They have all of these best practices, let's say. But then to what extent those were sort of ad hoc, or to what extent those were actually institutionalized in the way that the Fajia state was institutionalized, that constrained the state instead of just empower the state, is something that I think Confucians and the Zhuangzi certainly didn't get into too much.
All right, so I have another question about Zhuangzi and personal freedom. I think that personal freedom is a useful way of getting into the minds of the authors of the Zhuangzi and trying to see what's appealing about the way of life that they recommend to people. But it's worth noting, and I think you would agree with this, Tao, that there isn't exactly a lot of language in the original text that we can point to as having some sort of one-to-one correspondence with what we now describe as personal freedom. And so sometimes when you're describing the Zhuangist ideal that comes closest to personal freedom, you use language that does, in fact, track with language that you see in the old texts. So you say what Zhuangzi values is living spontaneously or authentically. And spontaneously could be a direct translation of ziran, which you see quite often. Authenticity, or living authentically. Authenticity itself is a good translation of zhen, which you often see in the Zhuangzi. And as you rightly say, the Yangists clearly prized and valued authenticity, and it seems that Zhuangzi was influenced by at least that much of Yangism. Tell me what you think about this. People who are sort of strictly historical in the reading of Zhuangzi, who worry a lot about reading him out of context, might say something like this. What Zhuangzi seems to value, given his own language, or what the authors of the Zhuangzi seem to value, given the choice of words that they make, is living spontaneously and authentically. Now, it just so happens that if you live spontaneously and authentically, one feature of that way of life is that you live relatively free. You have a kind of personal freedom because you're not worried about what other people think of you, about whether you're performing the rituals correctly, right? Whether you're performing all of your role-based obligations and duties assiduously, and so on. So there is a kind of personal freedom there, but it's not actually what they value about it. It just so happens to be a kind of personal freedom. So similarly, this is to sort of maybe a goofy example, but let's say that I'm shopping for shirts and I'm really into sparkly, shiny shirts, and we go into a store and I immediately go for the sparkliest shirt in the store. It just so happens to be the most expensive shirt, right? For whatever reason. Maybe it's not so surprising because there are elements added to it, golden threads or what have you, that make it expensive. You might say, Justin likes the most expensive shirt in the store. Yeah, that's true, but that's not what I like about the shirt. I was just drawn to it because it was sparkly and shiny, right? And so maybe this isn't fair, but one could say something similar for the Zhuangzi, that, this sort of vision of the good life that the Zhuangzi seems to recommend to people just so happens to entail a certain amount of personal freedom. But that's not what drew the authors of the Zhuangzi to it. In fact, what they liked about it was that it was a way of living spontaneously and authentically. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Okay, I don't want to correlate these concepts. These are English concepts, obviously, whether it's freedom, whether it's humaneness, and justice, right? I don't want to presuppose that there's a one-to-one correlation. The kind of concept that I was gravitating towards in the Zhuangzi when I was talking about the personal freedom was more concept like the you, right? The wandering or the roaming, and the kind of domain within which the you takes place. One will be the fang nei and one will be the fang wai. And I translate that as the sort of outside the life world or within the life world. There are all of these sort of expressions in the Zhuangzi, which I take to be normative in the Zhuangzi, that you have all these fantastic, sort of expressions about the you, the kind of roaming that is just beyond the world, right? That's just wild, right? And then you have also these expression of the fang nei you, or the kind of wandering and roaming that's within the confines of the life world. And I take the famous butcher cook Din story was one such cases. So that I interpret cook Din as the famous 游刃有余, you run the chopper's edge in where there's in these gaps which become exposed to you after years and years of practice. I take that as a sort of political tale, and that it has a political implication. In fact, it was couched in terms of performance in front of a ruler who marveled at the cook Din's skill. So the stake was very high. You have a very limited room for maneuver. I take that to be sort of these consummate expressions of freedom as roaming within these kinds of ritually constituted life world or outside of it. That's how I sort of conceptualize or conceptions of personal freedom in the Zhuangzi.
I just wanted to sort of fill our listeners in on that particular issue of the kind of text and the language. And so this word yo that Tao is invoking, it's often translated as wandering, W-A-N, not wondering, but wandering. And in fact, the first chapter of the Zhuangzi is titled Xiao Yao Yo, which is sometimes translated as free and easy wandering. Wandering, so the character itself often appears in the text, and it's clearly a theme. And if we want to sort of give a just a kind of etymological account of what it means. I mean, the original kind of literal sense of the character, Yo, is just like what it sounds. It means to wander without worrying about whether you're following the road or the map, right? And so by extension, you could say it's something like, if you're kind of wandering in some figurative sense that seems to matter to Zhuangzi, maybe it's like living without worrying about whether you're following guidelines or following rules, right? And so that seems to entail a kind of freedom.
Because I contextualize conceptions of personal freedom in the Zhuangzi against this background of intellectual background that foregrounds conceptions of change and relationality. So change, everything changes, of course, death being one of the most, serious change, and the human relationality, human relationship being the most important one. So I take the Zhuangist project of personal freedom within this context of how to navigate the world that is characterized by this pervasive relationality and change. So that's another way of seeing how the Zhuangists sort of understand their project or personal freedom. One more just tidbits that I thought was interesting while what I was writing the book was that I found the expression, the xiang expression, xiang meaning mutual, in the text very, very intriguing in the Zhuangzi. There are very few xiang expressions that are positively valenced in the text. So they were all mutual stabbing, mutual kicking, mutual harming, and so they were all very, meaning that Zhuangzi was very sort of wary about this deep relationality in the human realm, at least. But then the only positive xiang expression in the Zhuangzi that I could find was the xiang wang, mutual forgetting. Even amongst the best friends, in fact, the best friends are the ones that would forget each other and let each other be. That's a really extraordinary understanding of the kind of wariness that Zhuangzi about relationality and the kind of burden that human relationality would constitute to people.
A bit more of a philosophical question, I suppose, about personal freedom. So this is just kind of a old chestnut or a question that people often raise about freedom. There's different concepts of freedom, of course. One question I've puzzled over for a very long time is about the value of freedom. What makes freedom valuable? And people have different views about this. But so one question I had for you, Tao, was, so suppose, you raise a kind of maybe Confucian-inspired critique of, or someone does, of the Zhuangzian kind of view of freedom, where it seems like the value of freedom, and freedom does seem valuable in some sense for sure, the value of freedom requires a kind of anchoring in the pursuit of something worthwhile, certain goods like maybe family, friendship, love, I guess in our terms, like maybe peace and justice. I mean, if someone's freely pursuing world destruction or something like that, or revenge for petty grievances, which I have also done. But I mean, it seems like just freedom itself, just mere choice without being anchored in some goods isn't really all that valuable. So I was wondering what you think. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm asking you as a philosopher, but also, how Zhuangzi you think might respond to that kind of worry or objection.
Right. This is the kind of question that was often raised about what about, somebody who was really doing all these really disaster, all these, really, really bad things, what to do about, what would a Zhuangist do about that? I think the Zhuangist, if I were to just wear the Zhuangzi's hat, I think ideally we would not even get to that stage, because the kind of problem, the kind of catastrophe that we see in the world was really the result of this mass socialization, this huge societies that we're able to sort of exact kind of suffering upon each other, the kind of sociality that was very, very detrimental to living an authentic life. So it's the kind that will be best if we do not even let the world get to that point. Because once it gets to that point, then I'm not sure anybody would have, a credibly good answer. Or any philosopher, would have you might have the right value, but then in terms of what can be done about that, that would be very, very, very almost impossible to deal with, to even imagine. I take that a Zhuangist would be more sort of valuing that if we can have just, sort of a friendly community anchored maybe in a smaller sort of human society, that would be more ideal as a way that humans live our good life, because that's where our natural endowments would have the least chance of being distorted and or leading to really, really disastrous consequences on really massive scale.
Okay, so it might be that he has a bit more of a restricted view about the value of freedom in the sense that it's not just freedom for any old pursuit that is really valuable. It's, freedom as he envisions it within maybe a smaller community without all this kind of chaotic, kind of these conflicts and violence. Yeah, he wouldn't be
ambitions. Yes.
Okay, and ambitions, and especially political ambitions and so on. So it's not just freedom isn't just simply just whatever anyone pursues. It's a more restricted vision as you understand him.
Right. And the idea of desire is also interesting. I don't think the Zhuangist would relish that pursue or desire to the maximum degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That's very helpful.
Well, okay. We have two questions. We're trying to establish a convention in these interviews where we ask our interviewee two questions as a closer. Hopefully you had a chance to look at them and you're somewhat prepared, but even if not, I bet you're able to answer off the top of your head. This is something about which scholars of Chinese philosophy usually have opinions. So I'll ask the first one, and that is, if you could pick out one insight or one piece of wisdom from your study of Chinese philosophical texts, a piece of insight or wisdom that you think would help people to lead a better life, what would it be?
One thing, I thought about this. I think one takeaway for me in going through these texts for the last decade and a half, if I have to think about the kind of value for our understanding of what a good life is, my sense is that good life is hard. It's because not only it is hard to conceptualize, because of the different kinds of conflict and tensions among these normative ideals, what supposed to constitutes good life or an ideal life. Those are not always in harmony. And also the sort of, how do we carry out? How do we execute? Once we have the strategy itself, is also really, really hard because so much is not really in our control at all. The kind of family we were thrown into, right? The kind of natural talents, the kind of natural endowments, and the kind of community that we have. There's so much of it that's really not up to us. In my takeaway for this kind of problem, that I think the traditional Chinese philosophy always resort to self-cultivation as one of the major source of solutions. And I think there is a lot of value to that. But also I wanted to be a little bit cautious on relying too much on self-cultivation, because then a lot of these other sort of problems, they're all just being thrown to self-cultivation as if that can solve all problems. And I'm not confident that's where it all lands.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So there's a temptation to understand at least some parts of the tradition, the Chinese philosophical tradition, as addressing all problems with self-cultivation. Self-cultivation being the processes by which you develop the psychological attitudes, traits of character, just sort of general skills, habits of thought, just general kind of psychological resilience, maybe even physiological resilience, to cope with all these challenges. But there's some Chinese texts where it's not self-cultivation that addresses the problem. And those include, I assume, the Zhuangzi, right? Or Taoist texts.
Right. Although Zhuangzi, I take him as a sort of heavy dose on self-cultivation, not all of it, but heavy dose on self-cultivation. And the Fajia thinkers, they were against self-cultivation, which again is interesting. Because self-cultivation is essentially, if I use a contemporary term, elitist. Yes,
right. It's a luxury that only people with a certain amount of leisure and wealth can afford. Yeah, so actually, if you Mencius, we haven't talked much about his political philosophy on this show yet, but someday we will. And he just assumes that there's a distinction between those people who labor with their minds and people who labor with their physical strength. He's thinking primarily of farmers, who labor with their physical strength, And they just won't have that luxury to engage in a lot of sort of deep self-cultivation that will fundamentally change their character.
Although Zhuangzi would say self-cultivation can happen in a non-elitist fashion, right? Because he definitely thinks ordinary people engaging in very mundane tasks can cultivate themselves through those very ordinary skill-making tasks. Okay. All right. Good. So I think the second question that we want to ask you, which we've been asking the other people we've been interviewing, is if you can recommend one text. And here, Justin, I think we shouldn't limit to just like Chinese philosophical texts, right? I think it could be also like a secondary source. You can plug your book right now also, but I don't think you can do that. But like another book, there's actually quite a lot written. And of course, one of the great things about your book, Tao, is you reference a lot of works. It was kind of mind-blowing how much you understand the tradition.
Which is why
What's
it took
one book that
15 years to finish, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. But even then, it was very impressive. Yeah, so if you can recommend one text that you think people could really learn from with regard to a Chinese philosophy, I guess in particular, what would you recommend?
Yeah, since I thought about it, I thought it was within the limits of these classical texts. I mean, everybody likes Zhuangzi, of course. I mean, anybody who read my book would know how much I love Zhuangzi. In some ways, my project was motivated by Zhuangzi. I think everybody would recommend Zhuangzi. But other than that, if I'm not allowed to recommend Zhuangzi, then I would recommend Lao Tzu. So I think it is actually the most philosophically sophisticated text in the entire early Chinese traditions. I think Lao Tzu should not be read as a Taoist text. I really mean it. It should be read as an early Chinese philosophical text before it was appropriated into the Taoist universe. Because to categorize it as Taoist would just distort the nature of the text because of the peculiar way that Taoism developed in later Chinese history. It's really an extraordinarily sophisticated text. And I still don't think that its historical impact on early Chinese intellectual history has really been appreciated at all. When people think about that as a Taoist text, they always, sort of project forward, but not so much within the scene of early Chinese preaching Chinese intellectual history. And also the sort of its philosophical insight, its moral political aspect, its meta-ethics, its epistemology, they were absolutely astonishing in the kind of insight that this tiny text contained. And I think it's still vastly underappreciated. It's so multidimensional. It has just, so much into it. Mysticism, ethics, meta-ethics, politics, military strategy, moral psychology, and so forth. I think it's a text that really needs to be read within the context of early China before it was absorbed into the Taoist universe.
Great. That's an intriguing and provocative answer. And thanks, by the way, of just sort of moving beyond Zhuangzi. I almost wonder if we should rephrase the question, Richard. What text would you recommend besides the Zhuangzi, other than the Zhuangzi?
Everyone has been recommending the Zhuangzi. And also, I apologize to all my students for introducing the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching as a Taoist text.
No. But we all do that. I think writing this book really forced me to... I deliberately not include later commentary. One of the reviewers, said, why didn't I cite Wang Bi's commentary or He Sanggong commentary? But I tried, but then I thought that actually took me away from the early Chinese context. So anyway, so this is why words or categorization is really, really important. That once we slap Taoism on it, then the term takes on the kind of that might not be relevant in the early Chinese context.
It sounds like the beginning of another episode someday. We could talk about that very issue. Well, this has been fantastic. I want to thank Tao for being such a good sport about this interview and our questions and putting up with the new technology and platform that we've been using in order to conduct the interview. And thanks for the wonderful discussion, Tao.
No, thank you. Thank you, Justin and Richard, for this wonderful opportunity. And for your hard work. And again, I apologize that you guys had to read such a long book. Really, I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion.
No, it really is a pleasure to read. It's not a chore, Tao. It's very interesting, Even the digressions on, Moist religion or the textual provenance of, these disputes about the text and everything. It's all very interesting.
Thank you.
So, so that's our discussion for today. Oh, I need to give everyone a preview of what we're going to discuss next time. Next time, we are finally going to look at closely a passage that I think everyone who has studied the Zhuangzi knows about. It's sometimes called the Cook Ding passage, sometimes called the Butcher passage. It's about a extremely skillful butcher who's able to perform his task and get deeply absorbed in his task in a way that is sometimes comparable to, sometimes even said to be the inspiration for all this research on flow-like experiences that we see in psychology today. So certainly if anyone knows anything about the Zhuangzi, they know this passage. It's long overdue for us to have a discussion of it. And we're going to bring in an expert who has written a great deal about skill, flow-like experiences, and Taoism. And that's Karen Li. She will be our guest as we discuss the Cook Ding passage. Looking forward to that. So that will be the focus of the next episode. And that was the way for today. We will see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.